Welcome again, everyone, to our EVRL Gauntlet previews. Today, we're going to be focusing on Pacific contenders with Pacific's casting's finest, AVRL. Now, AVRL, for anyone who might not be aware of who you are, why don't you take a second to tell us about yourself and what it is you do?
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm AVRL. I'm a contenders caster for the Pacific and also sometimes the Australian region, so dabble in a couple of those there. I've been casting casting contenders since the start of contenders in 2018, so I've been here for all 5 seasons so far. You might have also seen me at the Pacific Showdown, where I casted that tournament alongside Pixie with all the best teams across the Asia Pacific and all that.
Now, AVRL, I think it's fair to say that Pacific contenders is maybe one of the lesser followed regions amongst those at Gauntlet, to say the very least. So for people unfamiliar with your region, or at least for this season, can you give us a quick rundown of how the season went, who were the major players, and why did we end up with Talon Esports at Gauntlet?
So Pacific region actually has quite a lot of history to it. I think it's one of those places where you've got a region that's been around since the very early days of Overwatch. They had their own professional scene, like big stakes tournaments during the time of Apex and all that. So there's been a lot of things in the Pacific region that have been going on for a while, and Talon have kind of just been this team that, you know, have been building over time. They came in towards the start of contenders where they were not that famous of a team. You don't really understand who this team was. They were kind of a full Korean team at the time, and they did okay. And it wasn't until later in 2018 when they actually won a season you started to really notice them. And then later on as well, you know, following through the different contender seasons, you kind of forgot about them again because they were good, but they didn't win again. Pacific, interestingly enough, has this history of never having a repeat champion. They've never had a team win twice ever, whether that be in contenders or any of the other major professional tournaments. And then Talon comes around this year. This has been the year of Talon, where first season this year, they're the champions. And the funny thing about that is they came in as a non-full Korean team after the soft country restrictions. And at that point, we're thinking, okay, is this team going to be good or not? By the end of the season, they were fantastic. Represented the region at the Showdown, maintained the spot for the Pacific region, knocked out the first seed of China and lost one of their spots, and then comes in Season 2 as one of the major favorites for the Pacific region. And they've just leveled up since then. They've become an incredibly talented team, so good that they basically didn't drop anything. They dropped one map throughout the entire tournament, that is including both group stages and the playoffs. They dropped one map for the whole season. They are that dominant.
And I mean, building off that, Talon, as you said, defended Pacific's spot at Showdown against LG Ihuya, which has its own interesting story coming from the Chinese side of things. But back to Pacific, you talked about their map record. I think you got to look at their playoffs too, and they dropped across 7 maps, a grand total of 3 points. And I think that's like a particularly interesting thing to kind of look at, because it was just Kings Row, I believe, in the grand finals where those 3 points were captured. Other than that, Talon has been sort of on a runaway tear.
And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that this team has had a ton of support surrounding it. They've been one of the more longer standing teams across the Pacific region now. We talked a little bit about Pacific history, and they were kind of there from the start of contenders, but they've had, their roster changed a little bit. I think they may still have one player left from that original roster all the way back at the start of Season 1, 2018, right? But this team is mostly based out of Korea. They play from Korea. They have a team house there, all the players there, and because they have a team that has a Pudo, Patapan, they have non-Korean players, a lot of non-Korean players now. They got Mango, Jai, CQB, these are all their non-Koreans. They all go to Korea, play with the rest of the Korean teammates, play with their Korean coach, play on Korean servers, play against Korean teams, and in a way, I think you can attribute the success to the fact that, in my eyes, I see them almost as Korea's 4th seed into the Gauntlet, in a way, because in terms of skill level, I think that's what they represent. Obviously, they play in the Pacific region professionally in terms of where their official matches are, but in terms of where the practice is, that's all in Korea.
Okay, let's talk about what makes this team tick, though. You say they're effectively Korea's 4th seed, and they have the skill level to prove it. I mean, obviously, Patapan is someone who stands out amongst this roster. For anyone who remembers World Cup last year, will remember Patapan coming in and dominating there. But who else on this team can we look out for? And what makes this team such a dominant force in the Pacific region?
So I think their Thai DPS duo is definitely going to be two you want to look for, especially because I think we're definitely in a pretty DPS heavy meta at the time being. So Patapan and Apudo both are going to come out on those big picks. Patapan in general has a really large hero pool. I'm fairly certain he'll be bringing a Doomfist as well, so that's going to be quite interesting. Other than that, it's their whole team really just represents the best of the Pacific right now, because I'm fairly certain that across this 7-man roster, you pretty much couldn't make a better 7-man roster in the Pacific region if you took all the players across every single team in Contenders Pacific and you just mix them all up and you pick 7 people and you want to just pick the 7 best people. You just pick the whole entirety of Talon Esports. You pick these exact 7 players. So yeah, look out for the DPS duo, but really, I mean, their whole team is stacked from my perspective.
And I mean, so the all-star roster out of Pacific is one team, and it kind of showed, as we said, sort of the map score going through. Speaking of the map score, people will look at their score lines, right? And over the season, they will say this was an easy run for them, business as usual, etc. The coaching staff, though, did mention that there are a ton of languages, native languages spoken on this roster, and that communication was an issue, and they even calmed in English. Do you think that's going to be affecting them here, or is it something that we've seen them through these past seasons, and it's something they've sort of learned to deal with?
It's definitely the latter for me. I think if it was a problem, we would have seen that in their season, whereas I think mostly they've conditioned themselves to be able to handle that. This has been the second season running that they've had a mixed nationality roster, and I think a lot of these issues would have been bigger issues in the first season this year, and they've kind of ironed those out. Well, they should have ironed most of those out. They have a Korean coach, they have translators on the translator on the team, they have an assistant coach that speaks English, so yeah, there's going to be languages being juggled there, and it's probably going to be slower running to get reviews done and a lot of other things compared to just having a single language team. But I think we're getting to the stage now where, this is going to be maybe a bit of a long shot of a comparison, but you look at teams like Shock, right? There's different languages there. You look at Overwatch League teams that have been successful. There can be a lot of languages there, and they can still do really well. I know a lot of teams can also really struggle based on that, but I don't think Talon's one of those teams that is going to struggle for language.
Okay, but let's talk about then where you think they might struggle, because we don't have a ton of game footage for talking about what went wrong for Talon this season, right? They only lost that one map you mentioned earlier. So was that kind of just a one-off, or is there something that can maybe be exploited here, looked at by the other teams coming into the Gauntlet?
First of all, I think that one map was definitely a mistake on their part. They probably shouldn't have dropped that one map. I did not expect them to drop that one map, and really they had the opportunity to finish the entire season with a flawless record, and they would have been, I believe, the first team in Contenders in the current format to have ever done that. So sadly they did miss out on that little title. I guess it would have been a nice little thing to have walk into Gauntlet. But in terms of weaknesses, there's not a lot of, like you mentioned, there's no really good tape on what you could be looking to exploit here. I also think it'd be difficult for teams to review anyway, because we're moving into a completely different meta. So unless you have scrim experience versus this team, you just may not really know what you're coming up against yet. I would say, despite being an incredibly good team, they probably are still lacking compared to the top 3 Korean teams. So while I mentioned this earlier, but I see them as skill-wise closer to being a 4th seed for Korea, representing the Gauntlet, than what a standard Pacific team you'd think would be. They are probably still just not quite at the level of the rest of Genji, Runaway, Element Mystic, etc. And so far, even from my perspective, because they haven't really been pushed or they haven't lost, it's hard for me to say, okay, this seems like a particularly weak spot for me. I guess we'll find out as we move into a Sigma patch. Can they actually play that properly? Can they pick that up? Is that going to be meta that's going to favor them or not? And that that could create new weaknesses that haven't been there before.
Speaking of those Korean teams, we move on to the Gauntlet proper, and Talon gets a very rough first meeting, right? They get to play Element Mystic as their welcome to the Gauntlet. A team with arguably the best Doomfist in the world currently in Sparkle. Do you think that Talon, we sort of said, that they haven't had that experience. They haven't been forced to really show their hand. Do you think that with the meta looking very much with an Orisa, a Sigma, the Doomfist, that they have the flexibility, the ability to run up against a team that looks very at home in this event?
I think when you look at how teams have progressed between group stage and their respective playoffs in their home regions, the patch changed in a big way. We've moved from 3-3 goats into 2-2-2, and the teams that adapted well are here in the Gauntlet. I think, part of the reason we don't see teams like O2 is because perhaps they didn't quite adapt as well as people thought they would. So there's that. I think Talon definitely represent a team that have adapted well, because they didn't look worse at all. They looked like they had everything going for them. They had strong DPSs anyway. And it's kind of a case where, similar to Element Mystic, now you can take guys like Sparkle off of Zarya, and he was great at Zarya anyway. You can put him onto Doomfist, you can put him onto Genji, you can put him onto all the things he was known for back in the day. I also want to say that any team that goes up against Element Mystic in the first round is going to have a tough time. And you could literally put anyone there. If you put Atlanta Academy there, they probably lose to Element Mystic in the first round. I know NA fans might not like hearing that, but I mean, Element Mystic are probably just that good in this tournament. So I'm if Talon lose to EM, which is probably going to happen, I'm not going to be too surprised by that, because, as I said, I think any team would find that match super tough.
As a reminder for the format here, this is just the group stage, and 3 of the 4 teams in Talon's group will make it out. Now, assuming they lose to Element Mystic, they have to play the loser of HSL and XL2. Do you think that they could take on one of those teams and actually make it to the knockout bracket?
I would expect so. I would expect that Talon Esports are not going to be the team that is relegated or eliminated from this group. 3 teams make it out of here. Talon should be among the top 3 teams. If you are, I'm kind of, as you would expect, kind of hyping them up in the sense where, like, their skill level should be pretty high. They dominated their home region. They played in Korea for a full year. They've had that much practice against Korean teams on that level. If they're not able to come out of this group, that's raises some huge flags. I would expect Talon to be choking massively. They have to really deviate from what we kind of expect from them, deviate from what we know them from, deviate from their own game plans. Maybe they have a really tough time taking on the new meta, because otherwise, Talon at their best should be coming out potentially second in this group. Maybe if they're struggling, they come out third. But I think HSL is probably the team that will struggle the most in this group. They are still perhaps a bit of a dark horse, but I see Talon, if they do really well, coming second after Element Mystic in Group A.
It's obviously very tough to get an idea of how teams will play and perform against other regions. We haven't really had this experience yet. This is the first time we've seen true worldwide region play on LAN. We did see the showdowns earlier, but it was east-west, so to speak. But do you think Talon can take that top look here at the Gauntlet? You sort of said Element Mystic probably not, but in their group, assuming they make it out of that group stages into the knockout, do you think they can make some noise?
Yeah, I think my personal take on this team is, among the 10 teams here, really I think they should be within the top 5, if not the top 6 for sure. In my mind, they realistically shouldn't be in the bottom 4. If they do end up in the bottom 4, if they don't make it very far through the bracket, or they get knocked out super early in their group or something like that, again, something majorly went wrong for this team. This is a team that really should have done better, and top 5 means they're on par with the other 3. Well, they're marginally behind the other 3 Korean teams. Atlanta Academy is probably in there. Top 6 means you probably put Team Envy in there as well, or something like that. But I do see them making some noise here. I do see them being a team that can potentially cause upsets, that other teams need to be considerate of, because Talon, they're a force to be reckoned with.
Alright, Abel. Well, it's been excellent having you enlighten us about the Pacific region and Talon Esports specifically, but now we need you to enlighten us about a little bit of a more difficult subject to predict at the very least. AVRL, who is going to be our very first Overwatch Contenders Gauntlet champion?
Honestly, this is not hard to predict at all. It's Element Mystic, because they have Sparkle. It's pretty much as simple as that. I don't know, without wanting to make it too based on one player, I think this is a pretty heavy DPS meta that we're walking into. One that is somewhat reliant on having an extremely good Doomfist, and I think every other team that has a worse Doomfist, which is every other team, is going to need to be able to think about how they want to approach that specific matchup. And the other hero that's got a lot of prominence in the current meta is Bastion, so I wouldn't be surprised if most teams that feel like they can't match Sparkle's Doomfist is going to go for some sort of Bastion play, and that's the one thing Element Mystic need to watch out for. But EM, to me, are coming into this tournament as the heavy favorites for number one. I really think they should be winning this. The second would be, a close second would be Runaway, where I think they are also a fantastic team that have a lot to show. They have really great teamwork, really good tanks. Yaki's an amazing player, and to me right now it does look like a Runaway versus Element Mystic final.
And it should be said that even when Doomfist was not at his strongest, Sparkle was still making people, switch around just to counter him. So in an area where Doomfist is now the primary vector for wins, it is tough to bet against EM.
And let's be honest as well, their roster depth is insane. Like, you
Yeah.
can't even, let's say you deal Sparkle. You got Ixie and Doha on this team. You forget that Ixie exists, but he's still a top tier hit scan player. The guy can still pull out a ton of fantastic heroes. The fact that Element Mystic have another top DPS to fall back on, 3 tanks they can regularly play with, and they regularly do. Their supports are already pretty decent. Means that, in some ways they're kind of meta-proof. And in some ways, even if you deal with one of the major problems on this team, they will introduce another problem for you to deal with.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to see Exy on that Bastion that you mentioned a little bit earlier, but we are going to have to get out of here. Avril, where can people find you on the internet, on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at I'm Avril, I am AVRL, or twitch.tv/AVRL Avril.
Alright, well, thank you so much, Avril, for joining us, and thank you for watching. If you like this video, there's a button for that down below, and if not, leave us a comment. We're always looking to improve, but either way, make sure you stay tuned to Talon Esports for more Overwatch content.